The coal dust settled into every crack and crevice of the town, coating it in a fine black film that never truly washed away. It clung to the walls, to the streets, and most of all, to the people who lived there. A place where the sun barely broke through the gray smog, where men descended into the mines before dawn and resurfaced only after dusk, their faces smeared with sweat and soot. To be born in Blackridge meant one thing: you either worked in the mines, or you starved. At least, that's what my father always said. "Mining is in our blood, Oliver," he'd remind me every time he caught me with a book instead of a pickaxe. "Your grandfather, his father before him, hell, even your brothers. You think you're too good for this?" I wasn't too good for it. But I wanted something more. I saw what mining did to people. My father had a permanent cough that rattled his chest like loose stones in a tin can. My oldest brother, Matthew, had a twisted leg from a tunnel collapse when he was 17. Our neighbor, Mr. Callahan, went down to work one morning and never came back up. Mining didn't care about loyalty. It swallowed men whole. Every evening, I sat by the small window in our cramped house, the single flickering lamp barely enough to illuminate the pages of my textbooks. I wanted to be an engineer, to design buildings that scraped the sky, roads that stretched beyond the suffocating limits of Blackridge. I dreamed of cities where the air didn't smell of burning coal, where men didn't cough themselves to death before 40. But in our house, dreams were a luxury we couldn't afford. "You think that fancy book is gonna feed us?" my brother David sneered one evening, knocking it out of my hands. "We work, Oliver. That's how we survive. That's how we die," I shot back before I could stop myself. The room went silent. My father's gaze turned cold, his jaw tightening. "Get out," he said. At first, I thought I misheard. "What?" "If you won't work, you won't live under my roof." I looked at my mother, hoping, praying, for some kind of protest. But she lowered her head, pressing her lips together. Matthew and David stood beside our father, arms crossed. They agreed with him. Just like that, I was nothing to them. With shaking hands, I grabbed my books, stuffing them into a torn canvas bag. My heart pounded as I stepped toward the door. I turned back one last time, waiting, hoping that someone would stop me. No one did. The door slammed behind me, sealing my fate. I was 16 years old, alone, and had nothing but the clothes on my back and a dream that no one believed in. But I swore to myself, as I walked into the cold, dark night, that I would prove them wrong. The night air bit through my thin jacket as I walked away from the only home I had ever known. My hands clenched around the straps of my canvas bag, my mind racing. I had no money, no place to go, and no plan beyond the stubborn fire burning in my chest. But I had already made my choice. Going back was not an option. The first night, I slept under an old railway bridge, my stomach growling, my body shivering. The next day, I searched for any kind of work, anything that would put food in my mouth and keep me off the streets. But Blackridge wasn't kind to those without connections. The mines were the only employer, and I had burned that bridge the moment I walked out of my father's house. I spent the next week scavenging, picking through garbage behind bakeries and markets, stealing bites where I could. Hunger gnawed at me, and for the first time, I felt the weight of my father's words. Maybe I was a fool for thinking I could make it without the mines. But just as desperation started to settle in, I found my first break. I overheard a conversation between two men outside a steel factory. They needed someone to sweep the floors and move heavy scrap. It wasn't much, but it was work. I stepped forward, my voice shaking but firm. "I can do it," I said. The foreman looked me up and down, unimpressed. "You don't look like much. Ever worked a day in your life?" I swallowed my pride and lied. "Yeah. I'm strong. I won't slow you down." He sighed. "Show up tomorrow at dawn. You mess up once, you're out." I nodded. The work was brutal. 12-hour shifts, hauling steel beams and breathing in thick, suffocating fumes. My hands blistered within days, my back ached so badly I could barely sleep. But at the end of each shift, I had a few coins in my pocket and a piece of bread in my stomach. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And at night, I studied. I saved every cent I could, buying used textbooks and sneaking into the public library when the weather was bad. I pored over pages filled with blueprints, equations, and engineering concepts that made my head spin. But I refused to give up. Months passed, then years. I worked my way up in the factory, earning enough to rent a tiny room and buy better books. I took night classes, sometimes sleeping only 3 hours before dragging myself back to work. By the time I turned 21, I had earned a scholarship to an engineering school in the city. The day I left Blackridge behind, I didn't look back. Years passed, and I became the man I always dreamed of being. The boy who once slept under bridges and swept factory floors was now the owner of Caldwell Engineering and Construction, one of the largest construction firms in the country. My company built skyscrapers, highways, and bridges that connected cities. My hands, once cracked and bloodied from hauling steel, now signed million-dollar contracts. I had everything I once thought was impossible: wealth, respect, a life free from the suffocating grip of Blackridge. And then, one day, the ghosts of my past came knocking. I was sitting in my office, reviewing blueprints for a new high-rise in the city, when my assistant buzzed in. "Mr. Caldwell, there are people here to see you." I barely glanced up. "Do they have an appointment?" A hesitation. "No, sir. But they say it's important." Something in her tone made me pause. I leaned back in my chair. "Who are they?" A longer hesitation. "They said, they're your family." My heart stopped. For a second, I thought I misheard. My family? The same family that threw me out like garbage when I was 16? The same people who had watched me walk into the cold with nothing? I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Send them in." The door opened, and in stepped my past. My father, once a giant in my eyes, now looked small and frail. His once broad shoulders had caved inward, his hair thin and gray. My mother stood beside him, clutching his arm, her face lined with exhaustion. And behind them were Matthew and David, my brothers, the same ones who had called me a coward and laughed when I begged them to see things differently. They looked different now. Older. Weaker. And judging by the way they hesitated at the doorway, desperate. I folded my hands on my desk. "You're a long way from Blackridge," I said, my voice unreadable. My father coughed, a deep, hacking sound that reminded me of the mines. "Oliver," he rasped, his voice raw. "We need your help." I let the words hang in the air. "Help?" I repeated slowly, as if I had never heard the word before. "That's funny. You didn't seem to need me when you threw me out into the streets." My mother stepped forward, eyes pleading. "Please, son. The mine's closed. Blackridge is dying. We lost the house, everything. We don't have anywhere to go." I studied their faces. They weren't lying. The town that had once lived and died by the mines had finally crumbled. The men who had spent their lives underground were now too old, too sick, too broken to start over. And now they had come to me, the same boy they had cast aside, looking for salvation. The irony was almost laughable. I stood up, slowly, walking around my desk until I was right in front of them. They all stiffened, as if bracing for my reaction. "You want my help," I said. "After everything?" No one answered. For the first time in years, I had the power. And I wasn't sure what to do with it. I let them stand there in silence, shifting uncomfortably under my gaze. My father looked at the floor, my mother's hands trembled, and my brothers, once so full of arrogance, kept their eyes averted. For the first time in my life, they were the ones who needed me. And God help me, but I wanted to make them feel it. I leaned back against my desk, arms crossed. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "You threw me out at 16. Left me to starve on the streets because I didn't want to waste my life in a mine. And now, after all these years, after never reaching out, never wondering if I was dead or alive, you show up at my office, begging for help?" My father flinched, just barely. My mother looked like she wanted to cry. My brothers said nothing. I scoffed. "Tell me, what exactly do you expect me to do?" Give you money? Buy you a house? Fix everything? My father cleared his throat. We just need a place to stay, he said, voice weaker than I remembered. Anything. A job. A roof. We wouldn't ask if we had any other choice. You had a choice, I snapped, the anger bubbling up. You chose to throw me away like I meant nothing. Now you want me to pretend none of that happened? David finally spoke, his voice laced with frustration. We were just doing what we thought was right. You were a damn kid, Oliver. You didn't understand. I cut him off with a bitter laugh. I understood plenty. I understood that my own family didn't believe in me. That you saw me as a failure before I even had a chance to try. He clenched his jaw but said nothing. I turned to my mother. And you, I said, my voice softer, but no less sharp. You just stood there. You didn't say a word while they threw me out. Did you even wonder if I was alive all these years? Tears filled her eyes. I did, she whispered. Every day. But your father. I shook my head. No. You don't get to blame him. You made your choice, just like the rest of them. I could feel the power shifting, could see the shame creeping into their faces. For once, I was the one in control. And for the briefest moment, I let myself enjoy it. I sighed, stepping away, rubbing a hand over my jaw as if considering their request. Then, with a small, cruel smile, I said, no. My mother gasped. My father's face darkened. No? Matthew repeated, his voice tight with disbelief. That's right, I said, meeting his glare head-on. You didn't want me when I had nothing. You don't get me now that I have everything. I walked to the office door and pulled it open. Find someone else to fix your mistakes. My father clenched his fists, but his shoulders sagged. My mother covered her mouth, barely holding in a sob. One by one, they walked past me, my brothers scowling, my father silent. My mother was the last to leave, pausing in the doorway, eyes full of regret. Oliver, she whispered. Please. I held her gaze for a long moment. Then, without a word, I shut the door. For the first time in my life, I had won. But as I stood there, staring at the closed door, a hollow feeling settled in my chest. Because winning never felt this empty. I told myself I was done with them. That shutting the door in their faces was the justice I had been waiting for. That they had earned their suffering, just as I had earned my success. And yet, days after that encounter, their faces haunted me. I couldn't focus on work. Couldn't enjoy the things I had built for myself. At night, I lay awake in my penthouse apartment miles above the city, far from the dirt and grime of Blackridge, staring at the ceiling, hearing my mother's whispered pleas. Over and over again. And it pissed me off. Why did I care? Why did I still feel anything for the people who had abandoned me? I lasted a week before my frustration got the better of me. I had to see them again. Not to forgive them. Not to help them. Just to say what I had been holding in for years. To let them feel, for just a moment, the weight of their choices. I found them in a rundown motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where the neon sign flickered and the walls smelled like mildew. I knocked once, then twice. The door creaked open, and Matthew's tired, wary eyes met mine. He froze. What the hell are you doing here? I stepped past him without waiting for an invitation. The room was small, cluttered with their few belongings. My father sat on the edge of one of the twin beds, rubbing his temples. My mother's eyes widened when she saw me. Oliver, she breathed. I ignored the warmth in her voice. I wasn't here for that. I turned to my father. You got a minute? He didn't answer at first. Just studied me, like he was trying to figure out if I was real. Then, with a tired nod, he gestured to the small table by the window. I sat across from him, folding my hands. He looked older than I remembered. Weaker. The fire that once burned in his eyes had dimmed, replaced with something I couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I exhaled sharply and said, I just have one question. His brow furrowed. What? I met his gaze. Did you ever regret it? He was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he sighed. No, he said. Not at first. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay still. I thought I was doing what was right, he continued. Thought I was teaching you how to survive. The world we lived in, Oliver, you either worked or you died. That's all I knew. That's all I ever knew. He rubbed his hands together, his fingers calloused and cracked. But when the mine shut down, when everything we built crumbled, I realized something. He looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes I never thought I would. Shame. You were right, he admitted. I should have let you try. I should have believed in you. The words knocked the air from my lungs. I had spent years waiting for him to say that. I had pictured this conversation 1,000 times, imagined all the ways I would rub my success in his face, how I would laugh at his regret and leave him to rot. But now that it was happening, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt tired. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling sharply. You don't get to rewrite history, Dad. You didn't just refuse to believe in me, you abandoned me. You let me freeze on the streets, let me starve. Do you have any idea what I went through? He swallowed hard. No, he admitted. I don't. I shook my head. Of course, you don't. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor. I just needed to hear you say it, I muttered. That's all. I turned toward the door. Oliver, my mother called softly. I hesitated. Please, she whispered. I know we don't deserve anything from you. But we're your family. I let out a bitter laugh. Family? I turned back to face them. You stopped being my family the second you let me walk out that door. Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. I stared at them for a long moment. They were broken. Once, they had held all the power, standing over me like giants, making me feel small. Now, they were the ones looking up, waiting for my mercy. It was everything I had dreamed of. So why did it feel so goddamn hollow? I sighed, rubbing my temples. I had a choice to make. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to make it. I stood there, staring at them, the family that had thrown me away, now reduced to nothing but desperation and regret. I had spent years imagining this moment. I thought it would be satisfying. That I would feel vindicated watching them suffer, watching them beg. But all I felt was exhaustion. I turned back to the door. Goodbye. My mother gasped softly, my father's shoulders sagged, and my brothers exchanged silent glances. But no one tried to stop me. I reached for the doorknob, ready to walk away for good. But my mother's voice, barely above a whisper, stopped me cold. You're just like him, you know. I froze. Slowly, I turned back. What did you just say? She wiped at her eyes, looking up at me with something different. Not just sadness. Not just regret. Understanding. You always said you didn't want to be like your father, she said. That you wanted to be better. But look at you, Oliver. You have everything now, and you're using it to punish the people who hurt you. I clenched my fists. And what's wrong with that? My father sighed. Because revenge doesn't fix anything, he murmured. It just makes sure no one wins. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words never came. Because deep down, I knew he was right. For all the power I had now, for all the success, I was still that 16-year-old kid standing in the snow, watching the only people he had ever known turn their backs on him. I had spent my whole life proving I didn't need them. And yet, here I was, still standing in front of them, still waiting for something. Closure. Justice. Love. Maybe all three. I let out a long breath, dragging a hand down my face. Damn it. I didn't owe them anything. But maybe that was the point. Without another word, I pulled out my wallet, grabbed a pen from the table, and scribbled something onto the back of a business card. I tossed it onto the bed. "What's this?" Matthew asked, picking it up. "The address to an apartment," I said, my voice clipped. "It's not fancy, but it's clean. You can stay there until you get back on your feet." They all stared at me in stunned silence. "You'll have groceries delivered once a week," I continued. "There's enough money in an account to cover basic living expenses, but after 6 months, that's it. No more handouts." David scoffed. "You think 6 months is enough to fix everything?" I turned to him, my expression cold. "It's 6 months more than I got." He fell silent. I exhaled sharply, stepping back. "Take it or leave it," I muttered. "I don't care." I walked to the door again, placing my hand on the knob. And this time, my mother didn't beg. My father didn't argue. But as I opened the door, I heard her whisper one last thing. "Thank you, Oliver." I didn't turn around. I just walked out. Epilogue, a different kind of victory. 6 months passed, and I kept my word. I didn't visit. I didn't call. But I made sure the money was there, made sure they had enough to survive. One day, I got a letter. It was from my mother. She wrote about how my father's health was getting worse but that he was trying. How Matthew had found a job at a warehouse. How David, the one who hated me the most, had finally swallowed his pride and gone back to school. She didn't ask for anything. She just wanted me to know. I read the letter twice, then tucked it away in my desk. I still wasn't sure if I had forgiven them. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't angry anymore. And maybe that was enough.